So I'm Steve Levitt. I'll be moderating the next session on economics of crime and the law. And I just want to take a couple minutes before I get started to give my own little ode to Gary. Maybe a decade ago, Pierre-Andre Chiappuri and I did an analysis of all the empirical papers published in the top journals in economics. And the question we were asking is, which theorists' work have influenced those papers? And so we went through paper by paper, and we looked to find the key citations. So not just a citation, but in the paragraph where someone said, here's why I'm doing what I'm doing, which theory papers were being cited. And that's certainly not the only measure of the value of a theory paper, but it's one measure of that value. So we went through, and it was a laborious process, but we eventually came up with some interesting results. So of all the economists in the world, with one exception, there was no theorist whose work had been the motivating site, had written more than 3 papers that were in our sample the motivating citation for what people were doing. And so there were people like Banaboo and Stiglitz and people like that who would, and even Bob Lucas, interesting, although we're only looking at empirical micropapers, where the key site had been their work. And then there was one other economist, and that was Gary. And Gary had 13 different papers, which had been the motivation for what people were doing. So Gary had 4 times as many papers as anyone else. But the thing that was so incredibly amazing about Gary's record is that those papers spanned a period of over 50 years. So papers, he had at least one paper in each decade from the 50s to 60s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the 2000s that fit that criterion. And no one else had anything like it. And as I reflected on why it was, I think Gary had a truly unique gift, which was he somehow is able to see what is ex post utterly obvious, but somehow ex ante is invisible. And he did it over and over. And if you think about a lot of things, whether it's the household or some of the stuff on human capital, the stuff on crime for sure, somehow Gary just had a way of seeing things. And once he saw them, it was incredibly easy for other people to follow him. And that's why I think he was so influential, and what's different about what Gary did in theory than other people. And certainly why Gary had such an incredible influence and was such an amazing mentor to me for all the years I've been in Chicago. So let me get out of the way. We have our first panel here. Each of the speakers will speak for about 12 or 13 minutes on some area, on diverse areas of crime and the law, and then maybe I'll pose a couple questions and we'll open it up to people in the audience. But let me get out of the way, and first it will be Bill Landis.
Thank you. I'm certainly quite honored to be here. I've given many talks honoring Gary Becker, going certainly to when he received a Nobel Prize, up until his 80th, gave a talk at his 80th birthday party. So it's hard often to find new things to say. But what I want to talk about today is much more specific. It's Gary's influence on economic analysis of law, and in particular, the influence of his paper on crime and punishment, which the Royal Academy cited in describing when Gary was awarded the Nobel Prize. And they went on to describe his approach as follows. And you can just read the first 2 sentences. A criminal with the exception of a limited number of psychopaths. So I said, I'm very familiar with this article. I don't remember Gary saying anything about psychopaths. So I went back and reread the article the other day. And in fact, my own view was it would have been inconsistent with Gary's approach for him to say that his model does not apply to the behavior of psychopaths. And sure enough, I was right. Gary says, and here describing his model, which is basically making choices under uncertainty, looking at the expected benefits and expected costs. The costs in this case, when you're talking about criminal activity, included the conviction rates and the sanctions. So I said, well, did he say anything about psychopaths or nuts? And I did find a passage which he talks about people who may be impulsive, insane, is that up there? Yeah, insane, young offenders. Basically what he was saying was making a straightforward economic statement that these individuals are less sensitive or less likely to be responsive to changes in the probability of conviction and the size of the sanction. And indeed, this led to what Gary recognized a kind of bizarre result, because it said, well, it costs society resources to apprehend and convict offenders. It costs society resources to keep them in prison. Well, if they're not responsive to these incentives, then we shouldn't spend a good deal of resources going after such individuals, which most people thought was a kind of weird and bizarre result. But Gary left it to others to bring in factors such as the incapacitation effect and the significant harm associated with the behavior of such individuals. Anyway, I don't want to spend time going back over the interpretation of this paper. What I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes is to mention to you that the crime and punishment paper, and this echoes Steve Levitt's point, gave rise to a very large empirical literature on the economics of crime, in which papers that range from Isaac Ehrlich, who was one of Becker's students at Columbia, Isaac Ehrlich's early paper on deterrence, which was his PhD thesis, to more controversial works on capital punishment. I did some work on the economics of courts and aircraft hijacking. Steve Levitt has done a number of papers on deterrence, including one dealing with LoJack. Even more controversial papers dealing with John Lott's work on right to carry handguns. But all of these papers, in one way or another, relied on Gary's initial paper on crime and punishment. All stress the idea that you can analyze the problems of crime under the assumption that offenders are responsive to costs and benefits or sanctions. And the paper also gave rise to a large theoretical literature. I won't go into that, but a literature in which people tried to extend and refine Gary's paper, including papers dealing with the choice between prison and fines, private versus public enforcement. But what I'd like to do today, at least, is try to give you some sense, of the importance of Gary's work in law and economics. And I think it's really twofold. The first is important. The second, in my own, it's personal, but I think Gary had an important personal influence on encouraging people to work in the field of law and economics. And I know that was an important factor when one looks at Gary's life and says, what was his impact on law and economics? It was not just the articles he wrote, but it was also his personal influence. So I'll give you some examples of that after I first go over some of these figures. These are figures we have citations to Gary's work. The first is, I just will go by it very quickly. But that's from another paper I gave to celebrate Ronald Coase's 100th birthday, where I was comparing citations of Gary Becker to, in this case, Samuelson, Coase, Stigler, and Arrow. Obviously, Gary is a citation leader, not surprising. The second is related to the crime and punishment paper. And here we use the Web of Science, which includes citations in and to roughly 500 economics journals and 294 law journals, including most of the law reviews, other law journals, but also there are 10 or 11 journals that are, we would call economic analysis of law journals, such as the Journal of Law and Economics, the Journal of Legal Studies, the Journal of the American Law and Economics Association. And what you have is these citations to Gary Becker's article, right? And you can see what it goes up, starts low, obviously, and then rises. And then so one could ask, was that a lot of citations or little citations or what? It's obviously increasing, and I'll have an explanation for that. But what I did, I decided, well, let me compare it to another group of law and economics scholars. So I took a group of scholars, these were economists only, who had had full-time appointments at law schools since 1980, at distinguished law schools, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Chicago, so I'm included in this, NYU, and Berkeley. All of these 6 economists are considered important figures in the development of the field of law and economics. 5 of the 6 have been past presidents of the American Law and Economics Association, and either 3 or 4 of them are fellows of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So we're talking about a relatively distinguished group of economists at law schools. And I said, let's look at how they are cited on average. And that's the dots up there. And it's kind of embarrassing, because what it shows is that citations to Gary Becker's paper and this is just in law journals, so we're not talking about citations of Becker's papers in other areas, the crime and punishment paper in economics journals. This is just law journals. And as I say, it's embarrassing. You've got here 6 distinguished economists at the leading law schools, and on average, right, the number of citations they've received for all of their full body of their work is on average the same as the citations that Gary received in law journals to the crime and punishment paper. I will say there's substantial variation among these economists. So they're all, some are pretty high and others are low, but I'm not going to name any names. The next is, you might ask, well, Gary wrote other pieces that would be of interest to lawyers, right? After all, he wrote the Human Capital, a treatise on the family, wrote papers on the economics of divorce. And I looked at citations to all of Gary's articles and books. I was able to add 5 books, but then there's articles only. And again, if you look quickly at that, you'll see that the crime and punishment article accounts for about 50% or 55% of Gary's citations in the area of law. The last one is the citations to the crime and punishment article, how important it is, was actually more important outside the field of law, as you can see by the citations in the economics journals and the law journals. This next will take just a couple minutes, but probably you'll find it humorous as well. This is the question of Gary Becker's, encouragement, influence on people who were starting out in the field of law and economics. And you have to understand at that time, there was a great hostility to applying economics to law. It was okay to apply economics to the areas of antitrust or business regulation, but the idea that economics would have some bearing on legal doctrines governing torts or contracts or intellectual property or, God forbid, legal precedent or criminal procedure or civil procedure, this was treated uniformly with ridicule in the legal academics. So I pulled off 2 quotes. One, a conversation I had with Dick Posner, and he was describing what really smart law professors said about economics. It was either wrong or if it was right, it was obvious. And I think what they had in mind was Ronald Coase. The next was a well-known historian at Harvard Law School, Mort Horowitz, and he wrote this in 1980, which is economic analysis of law has peaked out as the latest fad in legal scholarship, and future legal historians will need to exercise their imagination to figure out why so many people could have taken such stuff so seriously. He even added why so many smart people could have taken such stuff. Well, he turned out to be clearly wrong. I think that is my last slide, although if I could mention two other things on Gary, and they're quite personal, so I thought would be an appropriate place to actually mention it. The first, and probably some of you know it, I was an assistant professor in the economics department in Chicago in 1968, and I had presented a paper at Greg Lewis's workshop. I present labor workshop on the economics of the courts, and it wasn't particularly well received. And afterwards, a good friend of mine, a distinguished professor who had just won the John Bates Clark Award, Zvi Grilikis, took me aside and said, "Bill, you're making a career mistake." He said, "Nobody's interested in what you're doing." He said, "To get ahead in the profession, you have to work on problems that people are interested in, such as production functions." I said, "All right." I called Gary, and I actually tried to reproduce what Gary had said to me. He said, "Don't listen to Zvi. These are interesting and important problems, and don't get influenced in your work by what happens to be fashionable today. Work on problems that you think are interesting." And Gary said he encountered the same problem, similar reaction among economists when he was doing his dissertation on discrimination. And he added what was the clincher for me, that applying economics to law has a real future and will be an important field. So I want to say we should all be so lucky to have gotten such advice during the early part of our career. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Next speaker will be Casey Mulligan.
Okay, I thought I'd just spend a little time today to talk about the papers Gary published in the Journal of Law and Economics, and I wanted to especially emphasize the first one because I think he was both proud of that paper and had regrets about that, and the regrets are interesting too. The title is Competition and Democracy. It was in the first volume of the Journal of Law and Economics a long time ago, 1958. And it's quite short, but packed in there is quite a bit of good economics, some Gary trademarks, and I think maybe a little vision of what some of our alumni will be doing in the future. So in that paper, he draws an analogy between the organization of private industries and the political process. And in both of them, he said, you want to start with a definition of the ideal. What's ideal competition? What would it look like? And then to connect it with reality, let's talk about the degrees of imperfect competition or entry barriers. And he saw entry barriers as really the key concept for making that practical step, both in the private and public applications. So in the political process analysis, he said, okay, let's define an ideal democracy. It doesn't exist, but let's define it. And that's no appreciable costs or barriers preventing an individual from running for office. And then he said, of course, actual polities, they have entry barriers. And this basic idea, it's caught on in political science. A significant part of empirical political science today adopts this definition when they make judgments and measurements of how undemocratic a country is. They're looking really at this very idea of entry barriers. The other idea in there, or Gary trademark, is to abstract from institutional detail. For sure, Gary knew about the institutions, but he thought those were an outcome of the more fundamentals, taste and technology, and entry barriers And he viewed that as something you'd predict, not something you'd build a theory on, the institutions. And then the last idea in there is that collective decisions are imperfect because of the small stakes in collective actions. Now you probably say, well, that's the Downs paradox. No, at the time there wasn't a Downs. When he was working on this paper, Downs had not published his book. And really he and Gary were working in parallel. They call it the Downs paradox, but we could call it the Downs-Becker paradox. That would be fine. Now he wanted to take, and he did take this simple paper to another level. He had a couple papers in the Journal of Law and Economics where he was looking at the effects of tastes and technologies on public policies, and he used that 1958 framework. But I think the biggest step he took there, the biggest next step, was his pressure group papers, one of which was in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And there he's using this trademark idea, the free riding that's rampant in political sector, abstracting from institutional detail. He had where the private sector economists use a production function that Bill was supposed to study and he didn't. Gary used the influence function, and the same sort of idea. I once did a tabulation, I didn't redo it this year, of the citations of that pressure group work, and it was probably the most cited QJ article in 3 decades. The QJ is a major journal with a lot of citations, but it was maybe the most cited one in 3 decades. But I would talk to Gary about that paper and these ideas, and he said, my work's being ignored. Now, how could he say that? And actually, he's right. And let me show you how he came to that kind of conclusion, or give you a glimpse of that. This would oversimplify. So I have 2 measures. In blue, I'm going to measure the real world, if you will. The degree of imperfect competition on the private sector on the left and the public sector on the right. And that's what's happening in our world, at least as we're measuring it here. So in the private sector, I'm asking, I got this from Peter Peshigin's work, what fraction of 6-digit industries have a Herfindahl index greater than 1,000? Now, to give you an idea, a Herfindahl index of 1,000 means like there's 10 firms in the industry, each with equal share. So the blue is representing less competitive than that, which is, I think, fairly competitive, but I'll let you be the judge. So it's like a quarter or a third would be imperfectly competitive in the private market. Now, in the public sector, here I'm not just looking at the whole US as Peshigin did, but I'm looking at the whole earth, all the countries, and asking how many people on this earth live in or at least in 1995, live in a country with a polity score less than 5. And polity is this political science group that's using this entry barrier kind of concept. Now, what does the score of 5 mean? I'll give you some examples. It's pretty imperfect. China fits in there. Iran, Saddam Hussein's Iraq fits in that category. This category excludes Russia, excludes Ukraine, Honduras, excludes the United States. The United States gets a perfect score in this database. So this is a pretty conservative definition of what fraction of the earth is imperfectly competitive. In fact, if you're going to vote in Cook County on Tuesday, take a look at your ballot and how many uncontested elections there are in there. Even the president of the Cook County board, Cook County is 5 million people. The president of the board is running uncontested. Okay, so arguably there's imperfections in competition everywhere on this earth, even in the United States. But here I'm taking this kind of conservative view. Okay, so that's the world. What about the economic analysis? Well, here's Peshigin's measure of the fraction of pages in microeconomic textbooks that deal with imperfect competition rather than competition. They kind of got it backwards. They got 3/4 of the books about imperfect competition, even though 3/4 of the economy should be analyzed competitively. On the right, I have, Gary and I did a little study. We looked at 5 years of the American Economic Review. There were 22 articles on the subject of modeling the political process. None of them featured imperfect competition. They were all about perfectly competitive elections. Now you might say 22 is a small sample, maybe you just got 0 by luck. Well, the odds of that happening, simple binomial model calibrated to the blue line, 600,000 to 1. Okay, and this is why we're laughing, but he was frustrated by this and I was frustrated with him that he's not having an impact here, that so much of the earth is imperfectly competitive, but so little of the analysis is imperfectly competitive. Now, another thing I'll mention, I should really say, especially for the students here, one thing I admire about Gary's work, I admire many things, but one of the things I admired, he worked on the economy with a Y, not the economists with an S, okay? But he had a youthful deviation in this paper. If you look at the first word of the paper is economists, okay? Students don't do that, but he did that. But if we take that as given, he had an interesting prediction there. He said that, well, you should, among economists who are human beings, you should expect this bias, okay? They want to move activities from the private sector to the public sector. So of course you're going to want to exaggerate the imperfections in the private sector, and you want to understate the imperfections in the public sector, because that's the way you want to move the activity. So he predicted that. I'm not saying he's right or wrong, or I would have wrote the paper, but that's what he predicted, and here we are many years later, and the data fit that. So this is one of my favorite pictures of Gary playing softball with the students. And I think the students, the alumni, come in at this stage in the game. Competition and democracy, the mission was not accomplished. And that's, despite the many citations, he didn't accomplish the mission and having that kind of impact. But I want to say yet, I think Chicago alumni, they won't all work on this topic, but some of them will be able to take that next step that he wasn't quite able to take, and so that imperfect competition gets the appreciation it deserves and where it's deserved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Casey. Our next speaker will be Sam Peltzman.
I'm not going to have any slides, and the time is short, and I can't talk as fast as Jim Heckman, so I'll have to focus. I'm going to talk about one article, the one that Casey just mentioned, A Theory of Competition Among Pressure Groups for Political Influence, which is in the QJE in 1983. And what the influence of his work on the economic analysis of regulation has been. It's his most influential article, so I'll focus on that one. This is not a group where there are many people who would think of him as a major figure in the economic analysis of regulation, but he was. And let me start with where does he fit into the economic analysis of regulation? Well, he's part of a tradition which is trying to develop a general model of regulation. That is, what is it about government intervention in markets which has such variety in terms of the types of markets, the types of problems? What is it that we can say that's general? And he's part of a reaction to what had been the prevailing answer to such questions. What he's reacting to has sometimes been called normative economics as a positive theory. I think Roger Knoll and Paul Jaskow coined that phrase. And that it remains probably the way most non-specialists view government intervention. Probably the way most of us in this room think about it. As there's some market failure, monopoly, externality, whatever. It leads to an inefficient equilibrium. There is then ipso facto a regulatory response to that failure. And our role as economists is to advise the regulator on the best way to reduce the inefficiency. The reaction to this view set in about 20 years before Becker's 1983 article. And it was driven by important empirical and theoretical problems with normative economics as a positive theory. Empirically, it turned out that regulation often made things worse and not better. And theoretically, it exempted politics from rational behavior. Politics was about maximizing social welfare, whether rational or not. Now, this reaction had roots in other work. Casey mentioned Anthony Downs and the concept of rational ignorance, which we now see Gary also was toying with well before 1983. It had roots in the public choice revolution that followed Buchanan and Tulloch's calculus of consent. And probably most notably, it had a predecessor in Stigler's theory of economic regulation in 1971. That reaction has two central tendencies. First one is to bring politics back into rational behavior. We should treat regulators and all political actors as rational maximizers, not as disinterested social welfare maximizers. And second, if we do that, the results of regulation will often or even usually be more conventional deadweight loss and not less. And that last result came to be known as the capture theory of regulation. It's associated with Stigler probably most forcefully. It stressed the need for organizing pressure on the political process to secure a desired outcome. And it argued that organized pressure would usually lead self-interested regulators to an equilibrium which was further away from the social optimum rather than closer to it. And that theory also has exerted lasting influence. So an outsider's view of the economics of regulation often has, on the one hand, we have social welfare maximization. On the other hand, we have the capture theory. And it asks kind of, which corner solution do you like better? Now there then is a counter-revolution of which Becker is an integral part, which is arguing against corner solutions. It shares with the public choice tradition the rational actor and the importance of organized political pressure. You got to solve the collective action problem. But it argues that the equilibrium will usually be interior to the two corners. In Becker's formulation, groups organized to influence the political process to favor them. Basic scarcity leads these groups to compete with each other. The rent-seeking is essentially a zero-sum game, not, as we'll see in a minute, not entirely. And there's some equilibrium as a result of the interplay of the competition of these organized groups. And the equilibrium will involve some groups receiving rents, positive rents, and others negative. They have to pay. But the pressure is productive for everybody. That's the main point of the story. It either maximizes the subsidy to the favored group, or it minimizes the tax paid by the unfavored group. It all depends on the position and the slope of the relevant influence functions. So anybody who solves the collective action problem gets something in equilibrium, whether it's a bigger positive number or a smaller negative number. The most well-known corollary of this equilibrium is the efficiency result, which I will quote directly from the article. Corollary. Political policies that raise efficiency are more likely to be adopted than policies that lower efficiency. And the reason is simple. Deadweight loss doesn't benefit those who get the subsidies or pay for them. So all the competing groups will try to avoid them. They would even compete to induce the government to regulate markets with deadweight losses so that they can then haggle over the surplus that's created by that intervention. Now, that became a controversial result, especially among those who were skeptical about the merits of government intervention, because it seemed to resuscitate the conventional social welfare maximizing view of regulation. We had this grand synthesis of social welfare maximization with the public choice view, in which Becker's analysis is firmly grounded. Let me, in the limited time that I have left, try to evaluate this contribution. First of all, this right-wing angst about efficiency proved overdone. The efficient equilibrium that Becker is talking about is still in the context where groups have different political weights because of their ability to influence the political, organize and influence the political process. So what might be a deadweight loss in conventional normative analysis can be part of a politically efficient tax on poorly organized, rationally ignorant actors like me and you. It also proved somewhat useful in understanding regulatory change. One cost of either of the two corner solution theories is that they made it hard to understand regulatory change unless somehow the underlying technology changed. By contrast, the Becker kind of approach gives you a way of understanding how you could deregulate, for example, when the rents to distribute got smaller, or to regulate when they got larger. So that was a plus. From a longer run perspective, there are some problems. One is that comparative statics, which is the method which he used to generate his famous corollary, they only get you so far. With respect to efficiency, timing is very important. And you should, for example, compare the time it takes to remove a government inefficiency like the Interstate Commerce Commission as opposed to the time it takes to remove a pricing anomaly in the stock market. And you'll get a flavor of why to say that things are efficient in the long run in politics may not be saying all that much. The broader issue, I think, is the legacy of this article. In retrospect, this was the last of a line of research looking for general patterns in the vast variety of regulation. And I think that's too bad. If Gary lost, that's what he lost. He lost, his was the last word in this part of the literature, and it leaves a lot of first-order questions unaddressed. For example, this timing issue. Why does it take so long? Also, why is change in regulation decidedly cyclical? You can point to 2 or 3 time periods in the whole of the last 100 years in which there was really significant change one way or the other. Also, there's it mentioned the role of institutions in common with all of this literature, and as Casey pointed out, with Becker's decided tastes. Politics is treated as a black box, and that's just too simple. And a lot of economists in this area have worried about that. Legislative as opposed to agency discretion is legislative action as opposed to agency discretion is potentially important. Also, there's no role of politics as we ordinarily conceive of it. It leaves out that the winner or the loser can change with the next election, and a lot of issues that are connected with that. So just to end, Gary clearly was a seminal figure in political economy, and My only wish is that he had been, as Casey said, taken a little bit more seriously. He left a long agenda of unfinished business that one hopes will be picked up at some point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. So I want to pose a couple of questions to the panel, but let me start first with a little story. So I still remember well the first time I met Gary 20-something years ago. And I remember I reached out to shake his hand. I looked him right in the eye, and then I couldn't help letting my eyes just creep upwards a little bit to the top of his head, because I had been educated at Harvard and MIT, and at that time there was some kind of a general sense that Gary was somehow represented the devil in some way, shape, or form, and I wanted to just see if he might have little tiny horns on top of his head after all. And it's in some sense Gary won. I mean, he completely won, and I think the entire profession eventually came around. I mean, it took different parts of the profession different amounts of time. But it's easy to forget just how ostracized and criticized Gary was. So maybe Bill or Sam, you're older than Casey and I. Do you have any stories? Could you tell us some stories about a time when Gary, something that now we all kind of take that makes sense, that people looked at Gary and just thought he was crazy?
Well, that's part of something much more general. Chicago was viewed at the time that he was a student, and even the first few years, perhaps, when he was back on the faculty, Chicago was viewed as a heterodox place, a place you went to if you wanted to commune with crazy people, that kind of thing. It was part of. I have a PhD from this place, and I have a kind of a contrary nature, and it was part of what attracted me to the place. Everybody was saying this place is a bunch of loonies. I'll go and find out. So it was not unique. And this Harvard-Chicago tension was also, Harvard was very much the establishment economics department. In the period we're talking about, I got to say it wasn't that good a department, but it had this great legacy of being the torchbearer of the establishment. And, part of it was Friedman was obviously Gary's main teacher, and never bashful about pushing heterodox views. That's all in the past, I would think. I mean, look at Chicago today. We're swamped by Harvard and MIT, so it's a different world.
Bill? Yeah.
Yes, just I don't remember Gary being attacked, but I remember that his proxies were attacked, and that was mainly Dick Posner and myself were. But fortunately, I mean, I don't think you can understate how important Dick was to the development of law and economics, in part because, at least at law schools, in part because of his credentials. I mean, nobody could question that Dick was not a smart lawyer. He'd been president of the Harvard Law Review, first in his class at Harvard, clerked on the Supreme Court, so he had all the trappings of a very successful lawyer. So he was attacked. I was attacked because I worked with Dick, but Dick was much better at defending himself against the lawyers than I were. And what I do recall is there were many conferences we went to early on where we presented papers with other individuals. This was in the early, the 70s, on applications of economics to law. And invariably, the conference organizers always felt they had to get some anti-law and economics people there. And one in particular still stands out in my mind. It was a relatively small conference, and the anti-law and economics person, they brought a distinguished philosopher, Ronald Dworkin. And Dworkin's view was to kind of sum up where we are in law and economics. So he spent, I mean, it was beautiful to listen to him, but I could not tell you one thing what he said in a 2-hour attack on law and economics. Basically that, economics had no usefulness or relevance in law, because law was about moral considerations and justice. But as Steve said, that battle is over. And it's so over that economics is made, except maybe you could say in the area of constitutional law, economics has, I wouldn't say taken over, but is an important part of the law school curriculum. And even at our law school, there are, I'm a dinosaur because I just have a PhD in economics. Now at our law school, there are, and Anoop may correct me, he's out there, there are at least 4 people who have both a PhD in economics and a law degree. And that's of the younger people at law schools, at the major law schools. Typically you find a non-trivial number of people who have joint degrees.
Great. Let me finish with one last question for the panel, but I'm going to aim it particularly at Casey. So Gary did a particular kind of work. It was rigorous, but not particularly technical. It was loaded with ideas. He had a view that you could take price theory, Chicago price theory, and apply it to anything and everything. And I wonder, Casey, do you think that there's room in our profession today for someone, for young people, to look like Gary and to do things like Gary? And do you think it's a good thing or bad thing, whatever your answer is to that question?
You're asking me about the economist with an S?
Yes.
Uh-oh. No, I think we try to make it part of our training here that theorizing means abstracting. You need to use judgment about what's important. Eddie did a great job of that in his presentation. He got down to the simple part. And it's just not about how you do it. We have the methodology of positive economics. We empirically test these things. So whether the theory is complicated or simple, what matters is, can you understand what people are doing without ad hoc data point by data point? I think we still have that on our training here. I don't know if they have that elsewhere, but it's a hard thing to teach, and that's why we have to charge a lot, but but it's valuable.
Great. Bill or Sam, you want anything to say on that?
Well, I haven't been teaching in 9 years, so I'll pass on that one.
And now I'm now just teaching law at the University of Chicago Law. So I've been doing that. I used to teach economic analysis of law, but I got so good at law that they said, all right, you're smart enough, and I found it easier than teaching economics, to teach courses in copyrights and trademarks, although I do give them the economic approach.
Great. Bill, Casey, Sam, thank you very much. And that brings this session to a close. And thank you very much.